Welcome to another edition of Gussied Up Magic, where we discuss everything strange, unusual, and macabre. I'm Pat Bizardo Keefe, one of the three Appalachian witches who will be your host today. Our other two hosts are not going to be able to join us, and that's Misty and Ashley Connor. A special thanks to our producer, Wes Forsyth from Scarefest Radio, for all that he does. And our guest today has been a licensed funeral director, embalmer, and crematory operator for the past 15 years and has been a lifelong death enthusiast. The topic of tonight's discussion will focus on the golden age of funerals, the Victorian era, and the Victorians' influence on the way we handle death in America today. Amanda will also conjecture on the prospective future of the funeral industry. Thank you, Amanda, for being with us today.
Well, hello, and thank you, Pat and Wes. I would like to begin by thanking Pat O'Keefe for recommending me as a guest speaker on your podcast. And as we approach spooky season, I imagine viewership on Scarefest Radio podcast increases. So again, thank you for the invitation. I have a few things to unpack today, so I'll go ahead and get started. Unfortunately, the way that I met Pat was back in 2018 because of the untimely death of one of her friend's daughters. I want to preface by saying that the death of a child, even an adult child, is not something to be taken lightly. It is always incredibly difficult for those who are left behind. It's just not the natural order of events, and it's often devastating for the parents and other close relatives and friends. So during mortuary school in my grief counseling class, I was taught that the death of a child is synonymous with the death of the future in your mind. Likewise, the death of someone's parents is often perceived as the death of the past. And finally, the death of a spouse is likened to the death of oneself. It is often upon the death of a spouse that someone begins to consider their own mortality. So there's a little psychology for you today. I'd like to begin today's segment with a quote by William Gladstone, who was a former prime minister for the UK. He says, "Show me the manner in which a nation or community cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender sympathies of its people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideas." The Victorians certainly lived and died by this philosophy, as you are about to see. They were very expressive and changed their appearances, style of dress, and their involvement with society during prescribed mourning periods, all in an effort to outwardly display their grief. I have to say that is in stark contrast to what we do today. Today, we tend to minimize grief. People don't want to appear vulnerable. Going back to William Gladstone and the UK, who was the original Victorian? Well, Queen Victoria. So the Victorian era gained its name from Queen Victoria of England. Her reign was from 1830 to 1901. And although us Yankees over here in the States were doing our own thing, the fashion and many of the customs of the era were handed down from England. So it wasn't until years later that America began to mourn differently. The Victorian society of the 1800s was absolutely obsessed with death. Queen Victoria set the tone for this after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, and that was in 1860. She was devastated by his passing and mourned him for the rest of her life. It is rare that one sees a picture of Queen Victoria when she's not dressed completely in black. And that's one of the things that we imagine when we think about the Victorians, right? It was their style of dress. So you can see that her dress is very elaborate. It would include a corset, a hoop skirt, several petticoats, all designed to accentuate her feminine silhouette. I also would want to point out the fact that she's wearing a black lace veil over her hair. The Victorians had a penchant for small, intricate details. And Pat, I think I've seen several events that you have done where you were in period dress. So, have you got any thoughts on this,
Uh,
on the Victorian
Like you,
tradition?
I have a fascination with the Victorian age, and they're considered the second largest death culture outside of the Egyptians, and there's so much to unpack with the Victorians, and I don't want to say their obsession with death, but it certainly was. It was said that people would begin to save for a child's funeral the way that we today begin to save. Yes,
Mhm.
college for one of our children, and, there's so much and there's a reason why we see, people in the paranormal, so many people from that particular era, and I believe that one of the reasons is that when you think about, you go into these old buildings, usually they're Victorian, and we're seeing or connecting with spirits from that. It's not the only thing, but it's definitely for paranormal investigators, it's going on site to these older locations, definitely what they're interacting with. I saw a meme the other day and it showed, like a seance in the future where somebody would step up from our era with a cell phone in one hand, looking at the cell phone. So who knows what the future will present for people in the paranormal. But I think one of the reasons that we do interact so often with people from that era is they were so aware of death. And it was such a part of their life. I had read once that if you had 10 children and you lived in Liverpool, which was considered the the very poorest section, that you could expect to lose 6 of those children before the age of 2, and I forget how many more before the age of 5. It was just you had very low children being raised, and that's why the average
Mhm.
age of someone in Liverpool during that time was 15.
Oh my goodness, that
I know, because so many children died, and they skewed that because of lack of food, lack of, medical care, just lack of, warmth. I mean, these were very poor people, so poor that there were people on the streets that had really pretty teeth that were very poor, and the rich would go into that neighborhood, and if they needed teeth, fake teeth, they would buy someone's, teeth who was very poor, and they would do that to keep food on the table, and we don't even have to go into child laws. Children would go into the mines as young as 3 and a half, as long as they could take directions, and they would go where the men could not go. There's so many pictures of children coming up from the mines, I mean, 4, 5, 6 years old, and, some of them actually smoking cigarettes because it was considered by some like a good thing to do if you had been in the mines all day.
Mhm.
I'm sure children didn't think about that, they just watched their elders and imitated them. So yes, this was it was definitely a death culture. And you mentioned dress itself, and just one thing, and that is it was the first time that, off the rack clothes were introduced was during that era because everything was black.
Mhm.
It was definitely a death culture. Most people would wear black. Um, but what do you think about their funeral practices? Do you think that maybe they strong armed the populace, taking advantage of this whole obsession with death during that time? Um,
Mm, well, I think at that point, funerals were more so in the hands of the family, and it did become commercialized a little bit after that. I would say more toward the end of the 19th century, it began to be more commercialized. At that time, people were still being laid out in their homes. Sure, people had to buy coffins, but oftentimes they were produced by artisans or furniture makers. But going back to the death of a child, that is kind of the perfect segue to transition into discussing the Victorians because they experienced a lot of death, and especially among infants and children. In fact, it was common in the 19th, 20th centuries for new parents to open a savings account the week of a child's birth in anticipation of their likely demise. You mentioned that. And when I say their demise, I mean the death of both the expectant mother and the child. So if a child lived into adolescence, the money in that savings account that had been allocated toward funerary expenses could be redirected to either education for male children or a dowry fund in the case of a female child, because, women didn't want to further their education, right? So, very fortunately, I feel as though the improvement of housing, nutrition, prenatal care in America has greatly improved the infant mortality rate. And certainly it's uncommon for a pregnant mother to die in childbirth in modern America. And I'll give you a fair warning. I had planned on speaking about postmortem photography only because it was very prevalent in the Victorian age, and I have a couple resources for that. I have a few selections taken from the collection of Jack Mord and also from a book entitled Beyond the Dark Veil, and that was published by California State University. I want to preface by saying the intent behind these photos is not to exploit the deceased person that was photographed, but rather I want to frame the set of circumstances that people in the Victorian age were faced with. So the camera was a new invention, and it was very costly to have your photograph made. In fact, oftentimes these postmortem photographs were the only photo that a family may have of their loved one. These individuals are posed with their eyes open to make them appear more lifelike. In some instances, a veiled figure can be observed holding an infant or small child in an upright position. While these photos may appear extra creepy because you can see this veiled figure in the background, they are actually referred to as hidden mother photographs, because oftentimes the mother would assist the photographer in posing, in this case, a deceased child. But the practice of a mother veiling herself and holding the child was actually not due to postmortem photography. It was due to the fact that the exposure time on these new cameras was so long. They had to hold living children still. But there's one that is just an example of normal postmortem photography. It's a lady who is posed on a chair in an upright position with her eyes open. She is quite obviously deceased. In the next photo, we have a hidden mother who is veiled holding up a deceased child. And in the third photograph, I have actually I've tried to capture the practice where they used a piece of equipment that was designed to hold an adult body in an upright position, a fully standing upright position. And you know what? Coming from a funeral director's standpoint, I can attest to the artistry and skill that it would have taken to achieve those lifelike results, especially in the absence of modern embalming. In fact, I probably would have skipped right over the photograph and just thought it was a picture of someone standing up if it were not published in this book full of postmortem photography. You can see the stand that's actually holding the person up. If you look around their feet, you can see the wooden stand. And I've included a diagram as well, so you can understand better the way that positioning device worked. But it was fascinating, really, the artistry behind positioning these dead bodies without modern conveniences. I'm sure it was difficult here.
Let me mention that, this is still going on too, and the reason it was so popular, in fact, I saw an ad, for a photographer that said that he would get there if they would call him immediately before the body fixed, as he called it. In other
Yeah.
words, went into rigor mortis, right? So that he would get there and take that picture, because this may be the only image that they had of this person. One of the
Yes.
most poignant death photos I ever saw was of a family, and they were just so poor. The children didn't have children feet, but they were surrounding a child that was laying in a box, right, and kind of tilted
Mhm.
towards the camera, and, you could tell by, the position of the body that this was a little one who had passed, but the mother was able to not only get the little one, but the, children in the box also, child in the box, and what's really interesting is up in these mountains, I remember growing up and people would go up to see to the to the coffin and take a picture. It wasn't, uncommon at all in West Virginia, certainly, to see a picture of someone who had passed, laying in the coffin, and there's some really interesting ones. I remember a, man and a woman who had both died with their child. They had been murdered, I believe, and they were all put into one larger coffin with the child between them. So and I have actually had people contest this and say that that contraption, which is obviously something to keep a body still, was because, people would move. If you would move even a fraction, it would blur the photograph.
These
But
days, if we're going to take a photograph of a deceased person, we have to have it in writing that it's okay from the next of kin. Of course, if they do it themselves, that's fine. But it's not something that I would say is prevalent these days. In fact, I run into a lot of issues where people don't want to view their loved ones, and that's stark contrast to the Victorians. There's actually an identification requirement in Virginia that the person being cremated be identified in some means. You have different ways of achieving this. The easiest one is to get the family to view the body while they're here. But if they don't want to do that, we can take a photograph of the deceased and send it to them. And then they can sign off on that, saying that is in fact their loved one. Uh, Most people these days have tattoos or birthmarks or some sort of identifying mark on their body, but that's not always the case. Certainly during the Victorian times, you didn't have to bend someone's arm to get them to view their deceased loved one. But during the Victorian era in America, it was customary for a widow to remain in mourning for 1 year and 1 day from the time of her husband's death. And she would be expected to dress head to toe in black and remain sequestered from everyone but her closest relations for up to 3 weeks. After a period of 6 months, a widow would be allowed to visit others in their homes. And the second year after having lost her husband, a widow could integrate other dull colors into her wardrobe, like gray, white, or purple. And this was called half mourning. And they may be able to integrate things like pins made of jet or pins fashioned from hair of the deceased, or brooches, I should say, into their wardrobe to indicate their mourning status. The length of the mourning period was dependent on the relationship between the deceased and the bereaved. So if your parent or sibling died, you would be expected to dress in black and refrain from society, but for a lesser period of time. So for all the requirements placed on women, what was the customary sign of mourning amongst men, you might ask? And I bet you probably know what that is, Pat.
probably as long as it took him to get another wife. I mean, I hate to be rude about this, but that is usually I think it was considered rude if you did it before 6 months or went public before 6 months, depending on the level of society that you were in. But basically, as soon as they could remarry, they usually did. And you're right, the rules have always been much more strict, I think, on women and the way that we're supposed to mourn. I mean, as we know, there's some societies you're expected to throw yourself upon a burning husk of your husband, right, and burn with him. I mean, but they don't require that the man, if one of his wives would have died, that he's supposed to throw himself on her funeral pyre. It was only the wife. So you look at this and it's like,
Yes, ma'am, you got it. So all men were asked of was to wear a black band of crape around their arm, And you're correct. I was actually going there next. It was not uncommon that by the time the monument was carved for someone's deceased wife, that they would have already married their next missus. So yeah, that's interesting. However, women were required to observe not 6 months, not 1 year, but a minimum of 2 years of mourning, wearing black, remaining away from society. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the actual funeral or wake. So we're going to call it a wake because that's what the Victorians would have called it. What nowadays we would call a visitation commonly took place at the family home, with a formal service taking place either in the home or in a church or a cemetery even. Funeral homes were uncommon at that time, except maybe in larger populations or toward the end of the Victorian era. They might be more involved in assisting and laying out the body if the family didn't do it themselves, or they might just even sell a casket or coffin. As we know, the anthropoidal coffin was the more common selection at that time. What we would commonly call a toe pincher casket. Anyway, caskets could be purchased from local artisans like furniture makers or even purchased at a general store. Flowers were purchased by mourners to disguise the uncomfortable odor emanating from the dead body. There were methods to control the natural process of decomposition, but I would say most likely with negligible results. The use of cooling boards was common before the practice of embalming. A cooling board was like a lounge chair, like a wooden lounge chair with a built-in ice box positioned under the midsection of the deceased. And these were often made with holes bored in them so that air could circulate around the body, all over the body. These boards could be folded up into a briefcase so your local undertaker could travel from home to home, or maybe they were just stored in family homes. Who knows? As you imagine, this didn't do a lot to slow the process of decomposition. Also, the use of veils over caskets helped to keep insects away from the deceased. And Pat, if you are from West Virginia, I imagine you've probably seen a veiled casket before because we've done it
Yes.
here a few
Oh,
times.
yeah. When back in them days, as you said, I mean, you tried to bury, if you had your own family plot,
Mhm.
I mean, there was none of this, worrying about, documentation, this, that, and the other, not back in the day, and so they would do that. They would have your wake, and I have to tell you, I've seen a wake where they actually had the dead man sitting on a couch. They didn't dance with him like at some, Irish what they call Irish wakes, but
Okay.
he was sitting on the couch and, propped up, and people were, the men folk were drinking with him. I mean, they were very respectful. It was just part of what they did, and then they laid the corpse back into the casket. Now, the women folk weren't around for this. I just happened to be, passing through. They were all in the kitchen. It was their last drink, they said, with someone they loved.
I imagine you may have been just slightly curious. I think I would have been. Um,
I
that
was.
is
I was.
interesting. I can only recall in the past, I've been here going on 13 years, and I remember twice laying someone out in their home. Um, we did not use a veil. I have used a veil before because the family requested it. It wasn't necessary, but they requested it. Um, it does certainly prevent someone from touching the body,
Mhm.
and it would, if you were in an open air setting, prevent flies or gnats or any flying insect from getting to where the body is. So I'm not saying it's a terrible idea the Victorians had. It's pretty good. And you could certainly see through it without a problem. I would also say that it wouldn't hurt if you lived in a society that was riddled with illness or plagues and people didn't need to be touching the body. That
Mhm.
would certainly prevent that. So, not a terrible idea. 10 out of 10. I like it.
Well,
But
I know that when we have, um, plagues, like the
Mhm.
Great Plague. I mean, remember they would, walk through the town and ring a bell and say, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead," and they would bring out the dead, throw it on a wagon, they would put it in a hole and try to burn the dead or bury the dead depending on where they were at, and, fast forward let's fast forward, to COVID-19. There were places in the world where they were doing the exact same thing. In fact, I, was watching a woman, now, you always wonder, especially in today's society, is this real or was it made up? But it was an older Chinese woman, and they were interviewing her, and she said it was so bad that there was an old gentleman who was in the same room, they were sharing a room, and
Mhm.
that he had not drawn his last breath. He was in the death rattle. She heard that he was dying, she knew he was dying. But they literally came and wrapped him up and carried him off to the crematorium. And I could see where fear would drive people to do this. So when we talk about, especially in today's society, this fear of the dying or the dead, there has always, as we know, been a respect for the dead because it's written all over our mythos, no matter which culture you come from.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would say there is a certain measure of fear mongering there. We're certainly in a death avoidance society. I mean, people don't want to be too close to someone who's prospectively dying. So I could see where that the lady was concerned about that.
Mhm.
That leads me into the subject of embalming when we're speaking about sanitation of dead bodies. Uh, Dr. Holmes, Dr. Thomas Holmes, is considered the father of embalming, largely in part because he was selected by the United States government to oversee procedures performed on soldiers who died during the Civil War. So, for the first time in history, those who died on the battlefield were able to be returned to their loved ones who might be hundreds of miles away. But truly, it wasn't until the assassination of President Lincoln in 1865 that embalming really came into vogue. And you may have seen a television program on the embalming of President Lincoln and his nationwide train ride through the United States where his body was on display. By and large, the embalming procedure hasn't changed drastically throughout the years. Embalming is usually achieved through the pressurized injection of formaldehyde into the right common carotid artery. And as pressure builds in the arterial system, blood is pushed out of the right jugular vein. All of this can feasibly be done through a small incision right here on the clavicle bone. If an embalmer notices poor distribution of fluid in an appendage, a different vessel can be raised that's closer to that area to achieve better results. So, in the instance of someone's hand, a very visible place on the body, usually when you view a dead body today, you view the face and the hands. So, you don't want the nail beds to be dark, you want them to be pink and lifelike. And they won't be pink and lifelike if you leave blood in their hand. So let's say you start injecting through the carotid and you notice that perhaps their right hand isn't getting distribution. You could go to the brachial artery or you could go to the radial artery and inject there in a more localized environment and achieve better results. If the problem was in a leg, even though that area is not being viewed, you don't want it to begin decomposing. So you could go to the femoral artery and do the same thing. Um, Perhaps the best advancement in embalming has been the invention of an embalming machine. An embalming machine pumps pressurized formaldehyde through the arterial system. Prior to this, a gravity injector was used. You can imagine that the results through gravity injection were not nearly as thorough as what you could achieve with pressure being applied to an arterial system. You have to get the formaldehyde into the interstitial spaces between the cells. If you can't do that on a capillary level, there's going to be discoloration. Blood and body fluids that are left in the body act like a highway for bacteria. If you don't remove those items, then noticeable odor, purge from orifices, discoloration will occur. The field embalming that was performed during the Civil War was more from a preservative standpoint. And from my understanding, from what I've read, the results were not the best. Maybe the bodies were able to be returned, but they didn't look like themselves, or they had noticeably decayed in certain areas. Certainly by the time Lincoln was embalmed, embalming had come a long way, and he was certainly preserved to the best of anyone's capability at that time. So have you actually seen that program? I know it's aired a few times. It was formerly on TLC, but it may have transitioned over to the History Channel by now.
No, I have not seen that. It sounds absolutely fascinating. It's something I would watch. I just haven't seen it. So I will definitely look it up now because I'm interested.
Yeah, it's all about Lincoln's death and what happened to his body. And you might think that there's not enough to unpack there to, encompass a 2-hour show, but that there really is, at least for somebody like me. But it was fascinating to hear about my predecessors and the way that they handled death. They were really the ones that set the precedent for today's standards. These are my embalming instruments. These are forceps. These are used to help extract clots from the jugular. Actually, they would extend down into the right common carotid. Let's see what else I've got here. These are hemostats. That is something that would help me to clamp off a vessel if it's leaking. All right, so this is a groove director. This would actually fit down into a vein and help expand it so I can fit those forceps down in it better. And then this side of the groove director is an aneurysm hook, and that would be used to help retrieve vessels. Okay. What else have I got? This is a cannula. So this would actually attach to the hose on the embalming machine and go down inside the artery. All right. Pat was interested in some of the items that we use to set features with. So these are eye caps. She mentioned they're like contacts. They kind of are. They're like contacts that have small barbs on the inside. Sounds very comfortable, right? That would help keep the eyelids closed so that you don't get any peepers or winkers. If somebody comes in and they don't have teeth, we can use a mouth former or a dental former. These don't work in a universal fashion. There's times when we have to cut this down or use wax or cotton or something that's a little more malleable because not everyone is the same size. She specifically mentioned these. Okay, these are mouth closure pins. So we would use a specialized instrument to drive these into the gums of the deceased, and this would then allow us to wire the mouth closed. I prefer to do a mandibular suture. So a mandibular suture would be performed by entering into the mouth under the gum, going up through the nasal passage, going through the septum, coming out the other nostril, going back in the same hole, going down through the philtrum, back into the mouth, and then you go around the mandible. So you would go in front of the mandible, and then you would come back in behind the mandible. And that's going to allow you to sew the mouth shut. That is particularly helpful if the person whose mouth you're closing is not going to be embalmed, because embalming provides some extra rigidity or extra fixation. And if you're not going to have that in the instance where maybe the person's being cremated, or in the instance of the Victorians when they were posing people in these wild positions without embalming oftentimes, something like that would be really helpful. It's just extra added support, and you know that the mouth is not going to pop open, because how devastating would that be to have a visitation and the mouth pops open? So you don't want that. What else have I got here? I've got embalming fluid. Let me see how I can position the camera here. I use Dodge embalming fluid. This is restorative. Restorative is a chemical that acts as a humectant. So let's say the person's dehydrated and they need some firmness restored to their tissues, and they're just dried out. Let's say that you remove their socks and the skin off their bottom of their feet just puffs up like a cloud of dust. Add some of this in there and it's going to cure it. The opposite scenario happens more often, because people die where? In the hospital. And what do they do in the hospital? They put them on an IV. And when their kidneys fail, they get edema. So this is Edemaco. This is a fluid that helps reduce excess moisture or edema in the body. And this is helpful because sometimes edema is so bad that you don't actually have to have a wound or a hole in your skin. It will just weep out of your skin anywhere. So this right here will help take care of that. You can also, because I live here, I can go upstairs on my stove and boil some water and pour Epsom salts into it, and actually pour that into the machine instead of tap water, and that helps too. What else have we got? This is my most favorite embalming fluid. It is Intrafiant DC. It stands for Dinachrome. Intrafiant is a 30 index formaldehyde fluid. That's a rather high index, but the reason I lean toward high index fluids these days is because, cancer drugs, all of the things that people are being treated with in the hospital has a negative impact on the effects of formaldehyde. So if I went in with a low index, like maybe people used to do on a regular basis, it just doesn't produce the firming. It doesn't produce the color. I prefer high index. You notice this fluid looks almost purple. There are other fluids that have more of an orange tint to them because those are generally the two undertones that you find, pink or orange, depending on your ethnicity, your sun exposure, your age, things like that. This is an orange fluid that I like. This is Permaglow SS Brunette. This is a 24 index formaldehyde. Still higher than some other fluids. When I say a low index would be somewhere around 18. So it's a little bit higher, but not quite as high as Intrafiant. We have another fluid that I get from a different company. This company is called Champion Fluid. I get this from Champion because it's a very high index cavity fluid. Cavity fluid is used to treat the internal organs after most of the embalming procedure has been accomplished. So Pat's shaking her head, so I know she's familiar with this. After arterial injection is done, we aspirate the body with the use of a very long needle. It's called a trocar. Trocars are used in other ways. They're used in laparoscopic surgeries too. So some people are familiar with trocars, but we use a trocar to remove gas and excess body fluids from a body. We do this to everyone who's embalmed, and with permission, sometimes we do it on people who are not embalmed because maybe they have decomposed, maybe they have an just exorbitant amount of edema on their abdomen, and it's a problem. So with permission, we might treat the cavity even if someone's not embalmed. But we have this high index. It's a 45 index fluid from Champion to treat the cavity. You wouldn't want to use something this high index on the outside of a body or on the tissues that people are going to observe because it would dehydrate them beyond recognition. And if you were to spill this on yourself or on the person you're embalming, it would have a bleaching effect, and you don't want that. So, okay. So consumerism has certainly taken death out of the hands of individual families and has sterilized it. Death often occurs in the hospital or in a hospice facility rather than in the home. And then rather than caring for your own deceased relative's body, it's handled by a funeral director and prepared for burial or cremation. Services occur in a funeral home or in a church rather than the family home. And again, this is all a matter of convenience rather than, or I guess it's a matter of societal norms. While I can't imagine it's going to become common for people to begin caring for their dead family members at home, I can conjecture on some fairly predictable changes to the funeral industry in the near future. While we live in the Bible Belt, where it's common for people to cling to tradition, nationwide, the cremation rate is predicted to surpass 80% this year. So here in the South, we enjoy a relatively low cremation rate with lots of traditional burials. Two new trends that have not yet been legalized in our state of Virginia, but are up for legislation, include alkaline hydrolysis or water cremation and organic human reduction or human composting. Briefly, alkaline hydrolysis reduces a human body to skeletal remains by introducing it to a heated alkaline environment. It is somewhat slower than fire cremation, but the end result is comparable to the ashes produced by fire cremation. Organic human reduction reduces a decedent to compost by introducing the body to microbes that aid in the rapid decomposition of the body. This process can be achieved in as little as a couple of months. My prediction for the future of funeral service is that Americans are in search of a more simplified means of disposition, and that is quite the departure from the Victorians. I would encourage anyone who is shopping for funerary services to try to find a local family-owned funeral home who will work with them and charge them fairly. Um, I don't have a problem with assisting a family in handling their own memorial service, even if the body has been cremated. For example, if someone comes and arranges a cremation with me and they want to take the ashes to their local church or cemetery and facilitate their own service, I'm glad to help them with any of those details. Sometimes they want printed materials from us. Sometimes they need us to set a tent. Sometimes they may even need help with an officiant. I'm glad to help with any of those details. And I know there are other providers out there that would do the same thing. Another thing that I don't mind assisting families with is body donation. Body donation to medical science, that is. So we actually work with a company called Anatomy Gifts Registry out of Hanover, Maryland. And it's been a very smooth process. And the families who have used that service told me that they were very respectful and considerate of the family's needs. In fact, we even have one family who scheduled a memorial service and they wanted to actually have the ashes present for that. And that company made sure that we got those ashes back within an 8-week time frame, which is nearly unheard of when it comes to body donation. So, again, I would just encourage anyone who is prospectively shopping for funeral services. I know that sounds odd, but people really aren't loyal to particular brands anymore or to particular companies. If someone is shopping around, I wouldn't consider price to be the only consideration when you're trying to find a provider, but certainly take it into consideration. I would also look at what you're getting for your money. So I hope that
I have
answers your questions.
It does, and I have another one. Why do
Sure.
you think because there are still countries that don't have this, phobia, and I'm gonna call it a phobia of death that we seem to have as Americans, and certainly some European countries. Why do you think we have such a fear of death?
Well, hmm, why do we have a fear of death?
Well,
Coming from
everyone has a fear of death, but I mean, we hide our dead. Like, if you die in the hospital, they don't take you to the morgue now, they take you to the holding room,
you're
and
right.
they're like you said, they're retitling some things, right? So that
Mhm.
it removes the viewer from death, so they're not thinking about, there's bodies behind that door, and they'll do things like they'll actually pretend to have an intravenous, bag, right? And they'll move it along with you when you're already dead so that people will just think that you're being moved to another room or to surgery or something like that. Um, I
Yeah.
I tell you, I'll give one reason, but I will wait for you. What do you think?
It's so hard for me to guess because I don't shy away from such things, but I will not deny that the fear is there because we recently spent the past week at the fairgrounds trying to connect with people, just getting our name out there. And we did
Mhm.
have a lot of good conversations with folks, but there were a few that literally I saw them back up. They said, no, 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 no. And they kept
Okay.
going, and I get it. No one wants to dwell on that, but you'd be surprised the number of people that I've met that are never going to die.
No, so many, so many. Here's what I honestly it's not just death, it's anything associated with death. It's aging. It's we have had this focus on youth in our culture for so long that if you've aged beyond the age of 30, you're now considered elderly in certain fields. Certainly, actors start having more trouble getting bigger roles. We have people, in other, well, certainly modeling, those sorts of things, and there's this separation that we're trying to create between us and our final moments. I think people who are death aware and I will include you and I amongst those people. We know the inevitability of it, but we also have inside of us this idea that this is just one chapter. This is one chapter in a bigger book. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. I love to hear someone else's perspective on that because sometimes I feel as though, okay, and I think you and I have talked about this before. I tend to try and not internalize a lot of emotions because if I did, what would I be internalizing? It would all be negative. It would be associated with loss. It would be very difficult. And for someone like yourself, who perhaps is an empath or more sensitive, I would say, I think that's a skill that you've cultivated. And what I try to do with folks who are mourning is just be compassionate, respectful of their situation. I don't think anyone expects me to be sad. There are times that I am sad because we are in a small town. I do know people,
mhm,
but yeah, sometimes emotions are lost on me because I spent so much time trying not to internalize that.
right.
Sometimes when people aren't, as you say, death avoidant, I just don't quite understand it because I just see it as another step, and it's just something else that's going to happen to everybody.
Mhm,
But so many people don't want to recognize that. And
mhm,
I would encourage them to at least make a plan for
mhm,
their body, and I would hope their soul. But
mhm.
you just don't know. And I don't pry when I talk to people. I ask them the questions I need to ask them and make conversation in so much as they want to talk. Some people want to talk quite a lot. Other times it's like pulling teeth. So you know how it is working in the public.
This is something, though, that a lot of people don't realize when they think about an embalmer or a funeral director, their thoughts go completely to the technical end of what you do, and yet there is so much more that you do. I mean, you, in essence, are a death counselor, to people who are bereaved.
I have unfortunately and sadly been involved in more family disputes and situations than I have ever wanted to be privy to. And I'll take those to my own grave or the retort, I guess. Um,
Mhm,
but yeah, it's almost like a therapist or a guidance counselor at times. Sadly, I'm not trained in those arenas, so I try just to listen. But unfortunately, in this line of work, and I'll say this for any of you out there, any young folks, or even people in their second career that are looking to break into the funeral industry, I don't mind one bit to talk to you. I would be glad to. It was very difficult for me to even get a job in the funeral business. I guess that was about 15 years ago. Um, as a young female, no one wanted to give me a chance because they thought, well, she's weak, she's small, she's not strong enough, she can't help me. She's only interested in death. She's a death groupie. Um, I would be glad to give any talk to anybody about how they could maybe tailor their skills, things that would be helpful, help them along their path if they're wanting to break into the profession. I will say, when I first started in the profession, I thought I would be standing over a body for 8 hours a day. That's just not the case. You will spend more time talking to families, dealing with problems, solving problems. um, you have to learn to be more extroverted. If you think you're going to keep to yourself and stay downstairs with bodies all day, it's not going to happen. That's basically all I've got to say. And you've got to learn to be, you have to, I call it leaning on my professional crutch. That's what I have to do. So
well, I'm gonna ask you a personal question, and you don't have to answer it in full. My question is, are you thinking about doing one of the more unusual, wait, like the new water way of whenever you pass, or are you thinking of doing something? I'll be honest with you, I would like to be buried in a bag, and they do this out at Joshua Tree, California, and they plant a tree on top of you, so you are composting, and they probably do the microbes, yes, in a very real way. What about you? What would be your favorite,
So for me
personally?
personally, and I hope my apprentice doesn't see this because I tell her every week that she's going to have to carry out my wishes when I die and that it's crazy. So I want the full dog and pony show. I want it all, man, because I've had to do it for everybody else. So I want to be embalmed. I want the full service. Well, actually, what I want is a visitation at our facility.
Mm.
Then the next day, I want my casket to be taken to our church, and I want them to play doxology. And I want our staff, or maybe some deacons, I don't know, to go down front at that time like they would if they were carrying the offering plate down to the altar. And I want them to open my casket and then pull out my urn because I got cremated the night before. And and then I want my urn to go be buried up at Sinking Spring, which is behind our church.
Oh,
Um,
I love this. So you want it all.
I
Yeah, I
do.
mean, you want the dog and pony show, but you want condensed version, which is what I consider something, and this is what I'll probably do is cremation,
Yeah,
which is simple and easy for your people to do at that point.
it
Yeah.
is. It is. And Pat, just saying, I would come to Boone for free for you.
Oh, I love you to death. I do. You're awesome.
Well, you
I
are
would
too.
like to thank I would like to thank Miss, Amanda for being with us today. She is absolutely amazing. She is a top notch. I mean, I've heard other people say very good things about you, Amanda. You know how it is, small towns, honey. But she is a licensed funeral director, embalmer, and crematory operator. She has started her own business now, and we're so proud of her. And, thank you for being with us, Amanda.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Wes. We'll
Bye-bye.
see ya.